This is the historical accuracy of the movie Zodiac of 2007 by Celeste Lulay. Zodiac came out in 2007 and it was directed by David Fincher. It was based on the book by Zodiac written by Robert Graysmith, which took place about the Zodiac Killer and was about how he worked at the SF Chronicle as a cartoonist, and he really was able to get a lot of information about Zodiac. It follows the SF Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle, and the connection they had to the investigation team of Vallejo, California. The movie follows Robert Graysmith as our protagonist, Paul Avery as an additional journalist who also works for the SF Chronicle, and David Toshi, the lead investigator for the case. The movie recreates various murder and crime scenes in great detail. Now we get into how historically accurate the movie actually was. Now, firstly, here we have a depiction of the Zodiac Killer. This is Robert Graysmith's depiction of what the Zodiac looked like during the murder of Lake Berryessa, as described by Brian Hartnell's eyewitness account. Zodiac is wearing a kind of cape, and he's holding a gun, and he has a mask over his head. Now, in the movie, the Zodiac it's a bit hard to see, but it seems like he has that same sort of cape and he has the same mask. So it seems as they were trying to sort of create something similar, but not exactly spot on to how it was in Robert Graysmith's drawing. Now, something that was very inaccurate in the film was the relationship between Paul Avery and Robert Graysmith. See, the movie depicts them to be pretty close friends and colleagues, and they sort of work on investigating the case together. But in reality, both men had not even met or had contact with one another until they had both left the San Francisco Chronicle, and Zodiac was history. So they had zero contact, so any sort of contact that they had in the film is entirely fiction and made up. Something else that was sort of fiction was in the film, they sort of mentioned these black gloves a lot. This is a large piece of evidence in helping track down Zodiac. In the film, they're constantly referenced as belonging to Zodiac. During the murder of Paul Stine, they were sort of used to disguise Zodiac's fingerprints, so they assumed they belonged to him. Although in Zodiac, the book Zodiac, which was written by Robert Graysmith, the protagonist of the film, he writes about how Inspector David Toshi had told him that he learned that the gloves were not Zodiac's, but they belonged to a female passenger who had ridden in Paul Stine's taxi earlier in the day. So all the evidence that was used in the film to convince us that Arthur Lee Allen was Zodiac is entirely fictional, although the boots were something else that may have helped in the case to convict him. Something else that was sort of similar, although it had slight differences, was the real Zodiac Halloween card that was delivered to Paul Avery is sort of different in the movie. In the movie, the card is a bit bluer. It's a lot crisper, obviously, because it's not worn due to time. But they do try their best to recreate it as best as they possibly could. This is a video that interviews David Toshi about the letter that was written by Zodiac that was delivered to the SF Chronicle. This is his response to the public's reaction to the letter by Zodiac.
Since the release of the latest letter yesterday, our office has received additional phone calls from persons in the Bay Area who feel that they can be helpful in the apprehension of the Zodiac suspect. My partner, Inspector Armstrong, and I, who are handling the case, have received several phone calls this morning and this afternoon on various informants who have given us some information as to names, addresses, and locations that we have checked out and are checking out at the present time. It's generally stirred up quite a bit of interest.
Well, prior to yesterday's new revelations on the Zodiac case, how were the tips coming? Were they slower? Or?
They had subsided somewhat for the last 2 or 3 weeks. They were trickling in, but as I say, they began coming in yesterday afternoon, last night, and throughout the day, and we're on top of the case at the present time, but there are no new specific developments.
Now, what do you do with all of this information? You have to check out each item painstakingly until you're sure that it's either accurate or inaccurate?
That's correct. It all takes time, and we try to sift out the stronger leads for the present time and get to the lighter information as soon as we can. In a case of this magnitude, we stay on top of it as much as we can.
Okay. I see. I see. Mr. Willie, no, sir, not as insofar as our investigation has gone at this time. You are attempting to decode the last cryptogram, is that it? Yeah. I see.
Now, these are some of my personal thoughts regarding the film and how I thought that it went and how much I enjoyed it. To start, I actually really did enjoy the film. I found myself really being engaged with it. It really set the mood with myself to watch it. I set the room dark, and it felt a lot more like I was engaged with this film rather than something else that was boring and not catching my attention. This really caught my attention, and I was super engaged with it. Fincher does a great job as making us feel like we're one of the characters working at the SF Chronicle, because he shows us insight of how they are actively learning things. As the characters learn something, we, the audience, learn it too, and it gains suspense in us. I found myself waiting to learn more information and waiting to learn how they would find out a new piece of information or evidence in their ongoing case. There were lots of twists and turns that make it feel like as if this were some sort of fiction or made up, but the fact that it is real makes it feel like, wow, this really happened. I can't believe this actually happened. Maybe I should look into this, or maybe I want to find out more about what really happened in this real life case. I really enjoyed a lot of the cinematography in this film, like in this one screen catch. It shows one murder scene, and you can tell that David Fincher put a lot of work into how he wanted to portray the murder and the crime scenes, because they're actually incredibly accurate to how they actually happened. Although you already know what's about to happen in these scenes because it's the Zodiac Killer and almost everyone's heard of him, it still makes you feel the suspense that you're wondering, are they gonna die? Is he gonna kill them? In this scene, in this screen catch in particular, the Zodiac comes up by the side of the car, and the character to the right, he's just sitting in the car, and Zodiac walks over, and he only gets a few sentences out before he is shot. And you don't expect that to happen because it's the first scene in the movie, and it catches you completely off guard, and it really sets the tone for how the entire movie is going to be. You really don't expect. And there's a lot of build up to the scene, actually, because the car drives by once, and the car leaves, and it comes back again. So there's a lot of suspense. You think he's going to take his time, but it happens almost immediately after all the suspense is built. Something else that makes this film a lot more enjoyable is that the characters talk about patterns that happen in Zodiac's killings. So you hear about these patterns, then you start wondering, well, what is this next murder going to be like? Because although many of us know that the Zodiac Killer was a murderer, we don't exactly all know how these murders took place and what happened at the scene of the crime. I remember in one particular scene, the characters were talking about how a lot of the murders tended to happen at a lake. So I myself started wondering, well, what's the next murder going to be? Is it going to be by a lake? And it really just caught my attention, and I was really engaged in trying to figure out, well, what was going to happen next? What's happening now? Jake Gyllenhaal does a really great job at portraying Robert Graysmith. He talks a lot in many articles about how Robert Graysmith felt very obsessed with Zodiac. And in the movie, it even shows how his marriage is ruined and his relationship with his kids is ruined because of his obsession with Zodiac. He even gets various calls which were suspected to be by Zodiac. So he basically put his family in danger and ruined his relationship with them all over this obsession. And Jake Gyllenhaal really portrays this very well. Although I was interested in figuring out what Zodiac was going to do next, Robert Graysmith took it to a different level. Well, his character, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, did. Because even I started thinking as I was watching, well, this is kind of weird. He's a little obsessive over it. In this scene, they sort of focus on his eyes, which is a very great quality that Jake Gyllenhaal has that makes him seem sort of crazy or insane, and in this case, obsessive. The dark lighting surrounding him in this scene is supposed to be kind of scary. It is a horror movie after all, and it really makes you feel sort of tense about what's going to happen. And although you know that Zodiac was never found because it's a case that was in 1968, it makes you feel suspense because this character, Jake Gyllenhaal's character, is in a separate character's home who knows something about who Zodiac is, or knows someone who is suspected to be Zodiac. And while you know that this character isn't Zodiac, it still sends chills down your spine because he's actively scared, and it really just shows how broken his mental state is, how he's fearing for his life, how he risked his own life because of this research, and he's going mad because he needs to know who Zodiac is. At the end scene of this movie, Robert Graysmith made a statement previously about how he needed to know who Zodiac was. He needed to look him in the eye. Towards the end of this film, he sort of assumes that Zodiac is Arthur Lee Allen. And at the end scene, he looks Arthur Lee Allen in the eyes at the Ace Hardware store where he works at. And again, he has a really great quality where his eyes are very large, and they sort of like convey more emotion than most. So they show like his obsessive and insane state of mind, and they show how deeply he looks into Arthur Lee Allen's eyes. And I really enjoyed that scene because it felt so emotional. He had so many looks, he had so many feelings that you could just see on his face. And I think it was a really great casting choice to put Jake Gyllenhaal as the lead character. This scene is another one that I really enjoyed because prior to watching this movie, I did a bit of research about who Zodiac was. Not who he was exactly, because no one knows, but who was the prime suspect. And while I was searching, the prime suspect seemed to be Arthur Lee Allen. And while I didn't exactly look into what evidence there was pointing to him, I just assumed there was some. But in this scene in particular really showed how convincing that the evidence was. One of the prime pieces of evidence was that he had a watch with the Zodiac emblem that said Zodiac. While watching this scene, while they grabbed his watch, this really surprised me, and I was shocked because this is a very pinning piece of evidence. And I thought it was fake at first, but upon looking into it, it was actually real. And they do a great job because they zoom in on the watch, and it makes you think, is this too good to be true? Is this fake? But it is real. I think they did a great casting choice here for Arthur Lee Allen. John Carroll Lynch does a great job of making this guy seem pretty unsettling, but also at the same time, you don't know it's him. While there's a lot of convincing evidence, again, like many of the other characters, we aren't sure if he is Zodiac or if he isn't. It makes the audience feel sort of conflicted about, well, is this the guy or is this not? Is everyone in this case making him sort of uncomfortable? Is he not really Zodiac? But he was also a convicted child molester, and he was allegedly frequently talking about being a serial killer named Zodiac, or how he would kill children. While the movie's intention wasn't exactly to convince the audience that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer, it did a pretty good job at convincing me. I don't really call that a complaint because it wasn't their intention, but it was very convincing. At the same time, I still felt a bit conflicted about whether it was him or whether it wasn't, and I enjoyed going through that back and forth with myself of, well, is this him or is this not? Again, the cinematography in this film is great. The lighting makes these scenes seem very scary, and this is a horror film, so they do a great job at making this seem sort of ominous and scary. One scene in particular, it's not pictured here, but a scene where a woman was kidnapped by a man who Zodiac claims to be him. Very ominous and scary because in the scene, we don't see what Zodiac looks like. They intentionally cut out his face, so it isn't anyone in particular that we know. So they cut out his face, which makes it all the more ominous because you just hear a voice saying these things, these real things that the woman claimed that he said to her. Although it isn't pictured, something else that I found really great about this film that I actually didn't notice until further investigation was that the actor who was used to play Zodiac in the crime scenes and murder scenes was actually a different actor every time. So you couldn't exactly be sure depending on these different witnesses. Some children in the beginning of the film said that he was a stocky man with a crew cut, while some other cops said that he was an African-American man. Some accounts said he had glasses and some didn't, so you could never be exactly sure what he looked like. Overall, I really enjoyed this film, and it really kept me engaged and wondering, well, what's going to happen next? I think this was a great movie, and I would recommend it. Moving on to the critic reviews, Carl De Los Santos of Smash Cut Review says, the first half of the movie plays like a police procedural. It's a thrilling withdrawal of facts and dead ends and terrifying attacks that increasingly adds the sense of helplessness with the case. I completely agree with him, and he sort of leaves the audience with this feeling that you don't know what's going to happen. And you still wonder, well, what's going to happen? But you don't know because everyone knows that the Zodiac Killer was never solved. Some of the awards that this movie won was David Fincher won in 2007 the Best Director at the Dublin Films Critics Circle Awards. David Shire also won in 2007 for the Best Original Score for a horror and thriller film at International Film Music Critics Award. Sandra Serbo, who was the dubber of Robert Downey Jr., won in 2007 for the Best Male Voice at Il Festival Nacional de Doppiaggio Voci nell'Ombra. While I can't name them all, this movie was nominated for 71 different awards.